All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to your next set of notes on multiplying and dividing. If you're watching this video, you should have the first 4 sections done in Edgenuity, so you should be through adding and subtracting integers, which means that you are now 46% done with Edgenuity. So if you're not 46% finished with Edgenuity, make sure you do that first before you come here for these notes. But these notes that I'm going to go over with you today are on multiplying and dividing. So these are actually 2 separate sections in Edgenuity, but they go really well together because they're just inverses. So when you finish up the multiplying section, you'll be 58% done with Edgenuity for the 9 weeks, and when you get through the dividing, you'll be about 70% done for the 9 weeks. So that's our goal for this week, is going through here these 2 sections. So first off, we're going to start with multiplying. So the big key for middle school is understanding that whenever you see numbers smushed together like this and ones in a parentheses, that means multiply. So when I read this to myself, I don't say 3 parentheses 5. I read this as 3 times 5 because they're smushed together. There's no addition sign in the middle here, no subtraction. So I know this is multiplication. And so starting with the things you may have seen in elementary school, 3 times 5, we thought of that as like groups of 5, or we thought of it as like repeated addition. So 5 plus 5 plus 5. And so the answer here is 15. And so what we wanted to get to this year is starting using negatives more often. And so question number 2 here has a negative in it, but I can think of it as the same way. So 4 times -2, that's saying there are 4 groups of -2. And so if there were only groups of negative things, my answer is going to be negative. And 4 groups of -2, 4 times 2 is 8. And so I know that this would make -8 because there are 4 groups of only negative things, and so that makes -8 altogether. Good. For the next one, it's a little bit different, whereas the negative's not in the first column, it's in this parentheses, it's out in front of it now. So if I have this, I now have -2 times 3. And so if I have -2 groups of something, that kind of means I'm going to do the opposite of it. So there's a group of 3. I know that 2 groups of 3 would be 6, but since I have negative groups, they're telling me sort of do the opposite. I'm thinking -6 is what I get there. Perfect. And then the last one here, I get -7 times -2. And so this time I'm counting negative things, but I have negative groups of it, so I need to do the opposite. And this is kind of like before when we have minus and negative, they cancel. And so the opposite of a negative is a positive. So 7 times 2 is 14. They actually cancel to make a positive there. So based off these examples, we want to make some rules, and you may have seen kind of the pattern already of what's happening with the positives and negatives, and we want to make sure that we have these rules kind of memorized as we go through so that we can quickly do these in our head and not have to think about it as much. So here are the rules that are associated with these. So in the first example, I had a positive times a positive, and so that's what this rule is saying. So rule number 1 is if you have a positive times a positive, that's what you're used to, you're going to end up with a positive. But then for the next example, I had a positive times a negative, and the answer was negative. And so that's this second rule here. Without numbers, anytime, no matter what these numbers are, if you have a positive times a negative, the answer is a negative. Here, if you have a negative times a positive, the answer is negative. Same thing. This is just a rule that tells you the exact same thing without numbers. And then a negative times a negative is a positive always, no matter what the numbers are. So these are important to know, and they're going to, again, point out what's the same, what's different. You might want to have this piece memorized that, well, if you have a positive times a negative, that's the same as a negative times a positive. So we'll say if they have different signs that they make negative. If they have the same sign, they make positive. That's a way that you can kind of memorize these 4 rules as just 2 things. So if they're different signs, one's negative, one's positive, the answer is going to be negative. But if they're not different, then the answer is going to be positive. Good. So that's a lot to take in at once, but you'll get there. I promise it will make sense as you keep moving through. So we can memorize the rules and just try and do these things in our head, but we can also always show things on a number line. So one of the things they're going to ask you to do is show these things on a number line. So if I was going to show 4 times -3 on a number line, here's what I would do. This would be 4 groups of -3. And so with my pen here, you always are going to start on 0 in this case when we're multiplying. When we're adding, that's not always the case. You have like a starting point. But we're not going to start at 4 here because we're multiplying. So we're doing 4 groups of -3. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a group of -3. And I know that -3 is right there in the middle of -4 and 2. So that's one group of -3. And I'm going to keep doing that. So that's one group. So then 3, 6. There's a second group. So I'm up to 2 now. Then I'm going to keep going. Another group of 3 would take me here to -9. And then one more group of 3 would take me here to -12. So when I am writing this out, I'm saying there should be 4 groups, 4 jumps, 1, 2, 3, 4, and they should all be of length -3. So -3, -3, -3, -3. Good. And so I know that my answer now is wherever I ended up, and that answer is -12. Excellent. So that's the gist of the multiplication section. If you have these rules down, you know exactly what's happening. They will ask you questions about, hey, anytime you have a positive times a negative, what's the answer going to be? And you know the answer is going to be negative now that you have those rules. Good. Now, when we get to division, division is very similar. It's the inverse of multiplication. So there's going to be a lot of similarities. That's why I've grouped these sections together, because they're very similar. Now, this might intimidate you and say, oh no, we're back to fractions now. But the truth is, this is what I want you to have written down as your rule. Fractions are just division. And so don't be intimidated when they try and scare you with this stuff. All they're saying is that if you, instead of writing 10 divided by 2 like this, like you might have in elementary school, that's the same as writing 10 over 2. This is 10 divided by 2 here as well. So both of these, the answers are 5. They're just written in different ways. So fractions are just division. Whenever you go through this section, if you ever see fractions, just do your division like you normally would. Okay, good. And so the rules here are actually very similar to multiplying. So if I have 8 divided by 4, division is like splitting things up into groups. So if I have 8 and I split it up into 4 groups, hopefully you know that that is 2. Good. And so now we come to, again, the negatives. We're trying to work our way through, okay, what happens when there's negatives? So if I have -20 and I'm dividing or splitting it up into 2 groups, -20 divided by 2, well, that would be I'd have -20 things and I split it into 2 equal groups. And so that means that this person over here would get -10 and so would that person. And so if I split this into 2 equal groups, I get -10 there. But yeah, -20 things split up into 2 groups would be -10 in each. And then number 3 looks very similar. If I, in this case, have 20 divided by -2, well, I know 20 divided by 2 is 10. And whenever you divide by a negative, that means you just do the opposite of what it is in terms of the sign. So the answer there would also be -10. Good. And then lastly, a -12 divided by -6. -6 groups doesn't make much sense, but that just means you should do the opposite as far as the sign goes. So in this case, this is another case where the negatives will cancel. And so 12 divided by 6 is 2, I know. And then I'm thinking, well, they started negative, but then I need to do the opposite, so I should stay positive. So that is the correct answer there, +2. Okay. Now, you might notice something about these two here, and that the answer is the same. So it doesn't matter whether the negative was in the numerator up here, or if it was down here, because we know from above, if you have 1 negative, 1 positive, the answer is negative. If you have 1 positive, 1 negative, the answer is also negative. So the answer is going to be the same here, whether that negative is up here or down here. And so that really confuses people at first of saying, well, wait a second, doesn't it have to stay there or have to stay there? And the answer is no. And we even have a third way of writing it sometimes, of we could write it with the negative sign right in the middle. And so whenever you see fractions, sometimes you'll see that it looks like this, where the negative sign's out in front, and it's not even on the 20 or the 2. It's just kind of in front. And the truth is that the reason we can write this is because we know that it doesn't matter if the negative was first or the negative was second. If you have only one of them, the answer will be negative. And that goes along with those rules that are up here, where if you have one negative, it doesn't matter if it's second or first, the answer is going to be negative. And so same thing goes with fractions. It doesn't matter if the negative's on top or bottom, or if it's even in front like that, the answer will be negative. Okay. Excellent. So the last thing now is showing division on a number line. And so sometimes they'll ask you to say what's going on a number line with division. And so again, with division, we're splitting things up into smaller groups. So with show negative 12 divided by 4 on a number line, we're going to start with this total. So we have a total of negative 12. And so with one big jump, I'm going to go from 0 all the way to negative 12. And then I say, okay, this is this whole distance, and I need to split it up into 4 groups. And so with my mouse or whatever I'm using, I'm going to try and, in 4 jumps, get exactly to negative 12. And so I can just do trial and error. Let's try just jumping by the 2's here, by the negative 2. So if I do 1, 2, 3, 4 jumps, I didn't quite make it there. That wasn't far enough. And so I'm going to try jumping by more this time. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3. Well, that didn't work. So now I need to count by 3's maybe. So if I count by 3's, I'm going to get 1 jump, 2 jumps, 3 jumps, 4 jumps, and that works perfectly for me. So whenever I divide by 4 here, each one of these little jumps is negative 3. So I ended up here at negative 3, then I ended up here at negative 6, then I end up here at negative 9, then I end up there at negative 12. So the answer would be negative 12 divided by 4 is negative 3. And hopefully we can figure that out with our rules, because a negative divided by positive is a negative. And then you can just do 12 divided by 4, hopefully, in your head. But that's what it'll look like on a number line. You'll have a big total area that you're working with, and then when you're splitting it up, this is how many groups you have, and the answer is how far is each one of these little sections. So if you can figure out how far that little section is right there of the jump, and you can realize that that's negative 3, that's what they're counting by, then you've got the final answer there. So good luck on this section. If you have questions, let me know.